Think of Jackie Robinson breaking Major League Baseball's color line in 1947 as the beginning of a story rather than its final chapter. That history-making moment is like a spark that starts a national conversation and inspires an entire generation to champion civil rights and equality. Baseball alone isn't responsible for desegregation, but in the years that follow number 42's signature achievement, the game will continue to play a part in exposing inequality and helping to break down barriers across the country and right here in Tampa Bay.
There's a kind of unscripted quality to sports. I think that's the key. So you never know when someone's going to break through, and just their sheer talent is going to be exhilarating and capture you. And so part of what Jim Crow culture was everything was scripted. Whites had a role to play, blacks had a role to play. Sports often breaks that up.
I was just a kid trying to do the best I can to represent my neighborhood. But the barriers was broken in 1970 when a lot of the teams we played didn't realize we were black until we got there.
I knew it was different because I've always been that way. When something needs to be done and I could help, I would. Whether it's society considered female or male.
The Negro Leagues, the official league, which actually goes back to 1920, when the Negro National League was formed by Rube Foster out of Chicago. That was what we think of as the Negro Leagues, and it was important in terms of notoriety and publicity, and it was quite a going operation. They did pretty well actually for a number of years, till the late 40s. And in fact, the so-called Negro American League lasted until 1960 before it folded.
Similar to the major leagues, the Negro Leagues have a strong presence here in Florida, especially across the central part of the state.
So you have any number of teams playing. You know, in Tampa you have the Smokers, and in St. Pete you have the St. Petersburg Tigers and the Grays, the Sunshine Babies, you name it. They had these wonderful names. Probably the most famous team is the Pelicans. So you had a rich tradition, very closely allied with the black community on the south side of St. Petersburg, and of course in the Central Avenue area of Tampa. There were teams in Bradenton, there were teams in Lakeland, all over the state really, although most of the activity was in Central Florida.
We had a league out of Florida, West Coast Negro League. That was the name of our league. And we played here in Tampa, plays around Lakeland, St. Pete on Sundays.
These guys were good. Pepsi-Cola Giants and some other teams that were popular. They traveled to New York and all over the country playing, other teams. They'd have tryouts here. The tryouts were like maybe 2 weeks, and the guys would, really try to make that team, because if they did, they got to travel, they got to make a little money and do what they loved doing, which was, playing baseball.
There were some breaks in it in terms of fans. So sometimes white fans attended black sporting events, and vice versa under strict rules. There's a famous picture of the stands at Al Lang Stadium in 1950 with the colored-only section, and that was common. And it lasted well beyond Jackie Robinson's kind of great break in 1947.
A break that opens the door to the field, but not necessarily to the rest of society, especially in the South. More than a decade later, Jim Crow laws still won't allow black players to stay in the same hotels as their white teammates during spring training in Florida. Then, in the late 50s, local civil rights activists, led by Dr. Ralph Wimbish and Dr. Robert Swain, staged a series of successful protests, including boycotts and lunch counter sit-ins, that give them the confidence to take on increasingly bigger targets.
What Wimbish realized, especially during the boycott of the lunch counters, which eventually those restaurants all capitulated and allowed African Americans to sit with white patrons. What he realized is that they did that because it hurt them in the pocketbook. And he knew that Major League Baseball, particularly the city of St. Petersburg, was extremely dependent on tourism dollars.
In 1961, Wendell Smith, who was a crusading African-American journalist, very close to Jackie Robinson, wrote a number of articles in the Chicago American saying that the time has come to end the segregation of Major League spring training, that the African-American players, needed to live with their teammates.
It was Wimbish who started to have these conversations with Dr. Swain, and then he started to have them with Bill White, who was a first baseman for the Cardinals, Elston Howard, who was the catcher for the New York Yankees, and let them know, look, we're not going to house you anymore. We can't do it anymore. Enough is enough. And we think we have enough momentum politically to not only take a stand, but to be effective and to have a great impact, and to perhaps force these teams to either A, move and find another city that will allow integration, or to force the hotels to integrate their quarters.
In the spring of 1961, with pressure being applied by their own players, local activists, and nationally by prominent sports writers like Wendell Smith, the Yankees and the Cardinals are facing a serious dilemma.
Because you've got reporters asking, what are you going to do? What are you going to do with your African-American ball players? They're very important to your team. How are you going to house them? Because you can't house them in the hotels. And they said, well, we're going to make an effort. And that was a big concession, because they really hadn't made an effort in asking the hotels whether or not they would be willing to entertain the idea of allowing non-whites to stay in the hotel.
Despite the team's efforts, both the Vinoy and the Sereno hotels refused to house the Yankees and Cardinals' black players. Unable to come up with a solution, and with Fort Lauderdale offering up a new stadium and, more importantly, integrated quarters, the Yankees leave St. Petersburg in the spring of '62. The Cardinals stay, but only after coming up with a way to work around the problem.
They decide to buy their own motel. So they buy the Outrigger Motel out of the beach, and they move all of the players out there, and they can control it. And so, as Bill White says in his memoir, it was really quite wonderful. The players got to know each other in a way that they hadn't before, and their families can be there. And it's just a dramatic shift for him and the other black players, and I think it becomes a model for the other teams as well.
This has become a tourist attraction, and Bill White referred to it as our own civil rights movement. And what essentially they did was, they, not realizing it perhaps, but they normalized it. They made it show that, you know what, we can do it. And that tends is what happens with sports, is that sports takes the lead and it makes it okay for everyone else to do it.
By 1964, spring training was fully integrated. You look at it and you say, well, of course, it was inevitable. But then you look at the timing of it. You look at where we were in the civil rights movement in 1961. That was before the Freedom Rides, before the voter registration, before Birmingham, before Selma. That this was really sort of, in a lot of ways, as profound a moment in the overall civil rights movement as Jackie Robinson's integration of the game in 1947.
When the Yankees pull up stakes in 1962 and head for their new spring training home in Fort Lauderdale, Al Downing is one of just 3 black players on the team. Only 20 years old, the promising pitching prospect leans on veteran big leaguers Elston Howard and Hector Lopez as he learns how to navigate the complicated world of a black athlete during the civil rights era. Downing took some time recently to share those experiences with Chris Archer, a fellow pitcher and strikeout artist who was eager to learn more about what black players were going through in the 60s.
Did they ever give you any type of comparisons from St. Pete to Fort Lauderdale whenever you guys moved to Fort Lauderdale? Or?
Well, basically what they mainly said was what it was like having to live in St. Pete and live in private homes, not being same, almost like what we had in Atlanta, not being able to be with the players in the hotels in St. Pete, which was on the beach. I guess the hotel was on the beach, and the wives want to know why couldn't we be on the beach or something like that. And when you got to Fort Lauderdale, what had happened is Dan Topping had brought a partnership in this hotel called the Yankee Clipper, and there was a motel unit. Well, it wasn't a unit, it was a big unit. I mean, it must have had 80 units across the street. And he had housed all the major league personnel over there. So we had to eat across the street in the big hotel, but we could only eat in one room. The Yankee Clipper was designed like a ship. And so we were eating at the helm, and that was called the Clipper Room. And that was the only room in that hotel we could eat.
Wow.
And so they discouraged us from going into the hotel. So you go up these stairs on the front of the side by the Clipper Room, eat there and come out that way. And then one night, Elston and Hector and I decided after dinner, let's go down through the lobby. So we go down through the lobby, and we had to dress up for dinner. You had dressed up, you didn't have to have a tie, but a coat, jacket, and shirt. And we went down to the lobby, went through the lobby, went out to the front door, and we're standing out in front of the hotel, and the guy drives up in his car, and the 3 or 4 people jump out. He flips the keys in the air and says, "We're going to dinner, we'll be back in a couple hours." And we say, boy, if we were of the right mind, we'd be in Orlando in a couple of hours.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. So psychologically, how tough was that for you to perform on the field whenever everything was so separate, but then you're supposed to be a teammate and, you know, and deal with umpires and deal with fans? Can you walk me through some of that?
What was difficult was relating to your teammates, because you felt like, okay, in the minor leagues you had like, I think it's 22 players on the team. There are 20 players here, and then there's me and we had a fellow from the Dominican Republic over here, whom I had to keep reminding that you have to go where I go. You can't go with those guys, you go with me. And so I always felt like an outsider when you came in the clubhouse. And you don't know whether or not the guys are, you know, approve of you being on the team or not. And of course, I'm a young kid too. So it's my first full year, you know, being on the team and being in the South.
What's your opinion on the role that baseball had on the desegregation and the whole civil rights movement in general?
My only disagreement with baseball's role was that we still had segregation in Florida and throughout the 60s in spring training. So while, you know, you might have integrated the hotels, you didn't integrate the places where the players, you know, could stay, you know, as people, you know.
Right.
So none of these ball clubs said, we won't bring our business here unless you open up the hotels to everyone. And we stayed in hotels in Tampa back in the 60s, but we couldn't eat in the hotels until the late, almost 70.
So how'd that make you feel?
You still feel like when you walk into the ballpark, you see the guys on the bus, you know, going to the ballpark, but you don't eat dinner in the hotel in a restaurant with you. And you feel kind of like, you know, this is not right. Something has to change. But see, those things were left to the local civic leaders. That was their job to clean that up. But I think baseball could have done a better job of influencing them, because after all, tourism is a major part of Florida in that time.
Right.
And they could have
spring training.
They could have facilitated things tremendously.
Even in the late 60s, racial segregation is preventing kids from the Belmont Heights neighborhood from participating in Little League. But it doesn't stop them from playing baseball. And from the day it's founded in 1968, Belmont Heights Little League proves it's deserving. But what makes this sudden rise to prominence even more impressive are the circumstances surrounding the league's formation and how quickly it becomes a force to be reckoned with.
On June 11, 1967, there was a burglary in downtown Tampa, in the area close to what we now know as Channelside. And some young men were seen running away from that area toward Central Park Village, which is between Nebraska Avenue and Jefferson. This was on a Sunday afternoon. One of those young men was shot and killed. Martin Chambers was his name. He was 19 years old.
The circumstances surrounding the shooting outraged many in the neighborhood, especially Chambers' peers. Their frustration boils over, sparking riots that go on for 4 tumultuous days and nights.
Only thing I remember is when the National Guards were walking down Lake Avenue, and you know how they march and stuff. I didn't really get into it because my mama never let me get there. They kept me in the house, told me don't go outside, stay in the house. So the only thing I do is just watch from the window.
Next thing we were worrying about, next stop going to be 22nd. Oh no. And I was coaching out there during that time. And another friend of mine, Mr. Rouse, Mr. Harvard, and Coach Jim Williams. And we all said, man, we got to do something before we get over here. And so that's when we said, man, we got to keep an eye on these kids so they won't get involved.
Out of the violence and destruction of the riots, city and civic leaders realized they need to do more for kids in the affected neighborhoods. That's where the idea for Belmont Heights Little League is born.
After the riots, the civil unrest, baseball meant everything to our community. It brought us together. It showed us how to play organized sports. It gave us leadership skills. It mended and healed a lot of wounds. It brought trust back. I mean, parents and ladies were able to send their kids out, and the staff, the men that we had here at the league, they wanted the community to know that we were protected.
Also, the coaches provide a safe haven where kids can actually go, learn a skill, learn how to play a sport, and then compete at it. But the competition was real high level, even when we were small. A lot of the guys, coaches that came out was very competitive.
Just 3 years after its formation, Belmont Heights fields a squad that does something almost no one could imagine just a few years earlier. It makes a run in the 1970 Little League All-Star Tournament. This despite a lack of experience and the challenges that confront an all-black team in the South during a time when desegregation is still being resisted.
This was before busing here, so nothing really settled in their hearts yet about this whole thing. And now all of a sudden here's this baseball team that were presenting themselves at our park to play our child, and we haven't even approved them to go to school yet. So it was a problem.
First white encounter that I truly recall. We had played white teams before then, but we went and played Lutz. It was for the 1970 All-Stars. And I didn't think they realized that we were black. But when we drove up, it just, all chaos kind of broke loose. We just took the attitude that the coaches took. We ain't leaving here till we win it. And once we won, it was like we didn't have time to celebrate. It was like, get in the cars, get in the cars, get in the cars, get in the cars.
We got to go places here in Florida that I had never ever been before. So it was like, man, this is a vacation. I love this. You know, we go to these other ballparks and, you know, see how they operate, and it was great except for the umpires and then some of the parents. The kids, for the most part, were no problem, but some of the parents that we encountered, it was scary.
Despite the adversity it faces along the way, Belmont Heights goes on to win its first ever state championship, earning a trip to Al Lang Stadium in St. Pete, with a chance to go to Williamsport now in sight. Their run comes to an end in a loss to East Marietta, Georgia. But even in defeat, there are victories earned that can't be denied.
Not only that, you got young African Americans who display unique talent where they can compete with others throughout this country. But also, they represented the city. They represent the city of Tampa and the state of Florida.
We wouldn't think of it as a milestone. We didn't think of it as history. We just thought we were playing ball. And we were disappointed at the outcome. And, but what that did was that inspired others from behind us. They said, wow, they went that far. Well, we can do it too.
The success of the 1970 Belmont Heights Little League All-Stars serves as both motivation and inspiration for the players that follow. Between 1973 and 1981, Belmont Heights sends 4 teams to the Little League World Series in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. coming within one win of the title 3 times. And of course, there are the big league stars that come out of the program, helping make Belmont Heights internationally known. Among the dedicated parents willing to do whatever they can to make the league a success in the early 70s is a single mom who sees more kids than coaches and decides to do something about it.
They knew that I knew sports and I could do that. Of course, some rebelled against it, just verbally. Oh, what's she doing out there? She don't know what she's doing. Even some of the kids, they didn't want to be on my team.
That attitude doesn't last for long, as Miss Ann's team becomes very popular and successful.
Basically, all of them had to learn to respect others as they expect people to respect them, and then to work as a team, not as there is me in team, but in this team, there was all of us working together.
You look back in the 1970s where you might have had, gender inequality. We saw no signs of that at all, and I can, think back, to, those days. She was treated fairly, she was well respected, and, she held her own.
I didn't see it at the time, no. I just did something that needed to be done, as we all did while we were out there. We donated our time, not only to help the kids, but to have fun and do something that was productive and worthwhile.
In the 70 years since Jackie Robinson's history-making moment, baseball has become an international melting pot, with rosters made up of players from around the world. Today, programs like Reviving Baseball in Inner Cities, or RBI, honor Robinson's legacy by making sure the game remains accessible to everyone. Baseball alone can't end racism and inequality, but it has, and always will, bring people from all walks of life together to share a common passion around the world and right here in Tampa Bay.